Alexia, thank you so much for joining me. It's a real pleasure to actually sit down with you here at COP. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say you're one of my climate heroes, and I mean that sincerely. So thank you, and the opportunity to speak with you is fantastic. So just wanted to get your kind of an update from you with regards to what's happening at COP. Today was a pretty eventful day as it relates to announcements from ICVCM and VCMI. Maybe that's a good jumping off point. Can you give us kind of an overview of what's happening and your take?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me here, Renee. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Alexia Kelly. I'm the Managing Director of the Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative at the High Tide Foundation. We're a private family office philanthropy focused exclusively on the climate crisis. So we launched the Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative earlier this year to really help address what is an increasing chasm in the space that we operate in, which is the speed and the scale and the urgency with which we need to decarbonize and what the science is telling us is necessary to avert the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, and where the universe of standard setters really are right now as they're thinking about how do we push as hard and as fast as we possibly can with an increasingly limited set of policy and regulatory tools, particularly in the developed economies where most of the emissions come from, and also where much of the finance for the solutions to these challenges are expected to come from. And so this morning was really actually quite an important morning for a lot of this work, because the COP presidency, the United Arab Emirates government, brought together the full set of the ecosystem of standard setting bodies. And so for those of you who know this market well, because we do not have comprehensive regulation related to decarbonization for companies, particularly in the United States and in most markets outside of the EU, and the Paris Agreement is by nature a non-binding international agreement. So it's a legal treaty, but countries are really left to their own devices to design their own nationally determined contributions and to design and implement the ways in which they would like to contribute to the global climate fight to help us strive to hit 1.5 degree limited temperature increase. So this morning, we brought all of these standard setters together for a conversation here at COP28. And we had the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Voluntary Carbon Markets and Integrity Initiative, and the Integrity Initiative for the Voluntary Carbon Markets. Very confusing, I know, because they have the same name.
Lots of acronyms.
VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, deals with the demand side. So how do I, as a corporate actor who is voluntarily taking action, make a credible claim related to use of high-quality carbon credits that I purchased from an approved program under the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So the High Tide Foundation has been a core supporter of the ICVCM since its launch when it was the task force, which Mark Carney and a group of other bankers launched about 3 years ago. And we sit on the board and are very active in the development and evolution of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, or the ICVCM's set of standards. So the COP presidency brought this ecosystem together, and what they said is that these nonprofit standard setting bodies are committing to a new process and to work together to really ensure that we have a coherent framework for companies that are undertaking voluntary action to begin to make claims and have that end-to-end transparency and integrity that we know is so important. The other really exciting thing that came out of that session this morning is that Chairman Bredeke from the Commodities Future Trading Commission, which is the U.S. regulatory agency that has jurisdiction over commodities futures trading, as its name would imply, is releasing voluntary guidance. And so what that voluntary guidance is going to do is really start to help enshrine in formal government policy documents what best practice looks like in the voluntary carbon crediting markets. And so this is a really important set of recognitions and step change in the way in which the voluntary carbon market is being looked at and thought of, both by regulators and also by the group of nonprofit entities and organizations that really administer this space. So it was a really exciting and momentous day. And then The third major announcement that came out this morning was related to the existing voluntary standard setting bodies announcing a new integrity initiative where they will come together to coordinate much more closely across all of the work that they do related to establishing that high threshold for environmental integrity that we all know is so incredibly important to ensuring that this market can scale with full-facing confidence and deliver the environmental outcomes and climate impact benefits that we know are so desperately needed everywhere in the world today.
That's great. So a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
So, and there's been a busy news day, essentially.
Absolutely. Yep.
But they ultimately all deliver on the I component, right? In terms of integrity.
Yep.
An initiative, I guess they all have that kind of same nomenclature. But that's a really critical foundational element to ensuring the market's
100%.
longevity and that it can actually scale, as you mentioned.
Yep.
So these are wonderful steps, right? And it's essentially now a coalition of the willing. And now we're engaging with regulatory, regulators, I should say, right, to get the regulatory kind of purview on this commodity and this asset class, which is fantastic. Now, what are your hopes as a result of this coalition effectively now coming into place? Because effectively we're ending 2023. It would seem quite a hopeful opportunity really for 2024. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think what's coming out of this COP, and this is my first COP since Paris, actually. I was a negotiator for the US government. Yeah, so I came here expecting that we would hear a lot of the kind of more of the same noise around carbon crediting markets and the concerns around integrity, and it's actually been quite the opposite. I think the work that the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets has been doing to really do that comprehensive assessment across the entire market to understand the key areas where we really do need to improve the processes and systems that we're using to issue credits, and to introduce a greater standardization and comparability across the entire market from a standard setting basis that is going to enable us to get to the much more interesting and exciting set of conversations around how do we really start to leverage these markets and help them grow up so that they are delivering the high integrity environmental outcomes we know are so necessary, and also really starting to be a significant contributor to capital mobilization and climate finance mobilization, in particular into the global south. So there, was a group of African ministers that met this week to have a long discussion and dinner about the role of carbon markets in helping accelerate and advance core sustainable development, adaptation, resilience, and mitigation objectives in their countries. And I think in a world where we all know that there is not enough money to go around to address this critical problem that we're collectively facing, we need every tool available at our disposal. So as we go into 2024, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets will be leading a set of new, what we're calling continuous improvement work programs. But really what those will do is help to bring together the key players from across the carbon market in order to set that kind of and co-create that next iteration of what best practice looks like in the implementation of these markets. So for example, we announced when we released the full assessment framework a few months ago that we would be launching a new set of work related to DMRV, or digital monitoring, reporting, and verification. And what that will do is really help us think about how do we as a market and how do we as groups of standard setting bodies start to integrate and leverage this unbelievably important new resource set that has become available really only in the last 5 years and has been, I think, a big part of the challenge as we're looking at bringing to light some of the practices where data was not as widely available in the market. People were setting baselines with not particularly good data or the data that they had available at the time. And the increasing scrutiny that these DMRV resources have brought on the market ultimately will enable us all to do a much better job of issuing and ensuring that we're delivering that high integrity set of outcomes. But we have to have a whole conversation about what does that look like? How are we using these resources to streamline and accelerate the issuance and verification processes? How do we leverage these resources to introduce enhanced standardization and coordination and transparency, which of course is a core set of issues that we've struggled with in this market, frankly. So we have a lot of work to do in the next 24 months to really make sure that as we start to accelerate significant amounts of capital into these markets, we can have full faith and confidence that every dollar that's being mobilized is in fact driving real climate outcome and benefit, and is delivering desperately needed services and support to frontline communities and emerging economies in particular. So I'm feeling more hopeful than ever about the state of the market. And I think what we're hearing at this COP is an enormously unified call for getting on with the business of that continuous improvement across the market.
And that is really important, as you said, and you said scale over and over and over again.
Yep.
That's actually how we unlock that scale and that flow of capital at scale.
Totally.
By having that integrity and those strong foundational elements. And so now that progress is being made, this continuous improvement goes back to that point around, essentially, it's a spectrum, right? And it's a continuously evolving thing. Like you mentioned that historically, the baseline setting was done with imperfect data sets, essentially. And now there's been this kind of Cambrian explosion of digital MRV and leveraging satellite and LiDAR and ground truthing and a whole bunch of other kind of technologies to be able to provide and fill in the gaps where there was an absence of data. And then it's essentially opened it up to scrutiny to outside actors as well to ultimately help and define much more stringent baselines. And that's actively happening now at the standards. We see Vero just recently having announced and launched their new methodology. This is kind of the paradigm shift that's underway in the market. So I think that's fantastic, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that this is a very optimistic viewpoint. But there's still some very deliberate attempts to undermine markets, in particular carbon market, as a viable solution. And it would seem, and I had a conversation with Jen Stebbing previously around the lack of communication that's a coherent, concise and consistent voice for our market. It seems that we are very prone to tribalism and kind of diffusion. Everybody's focusing on their own little patch. But you're also part of a communications initiative right now underway within carbon markets. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as well? Because I think that communication piece is obviously critical as we help to then achieve that scale. Because it goes to the heart of confidence and establishing that confidence, or re-establishing that confidence in the market. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I'm actually a little surprised that we've struggled so much to tell the story of this market. And as someone who has had the privilege and opportunity to experience firsthand the incredible life-changing impacts of these markets for frontline communities, the finance that these markets deliver for things that are frankly just left out often of the formal economy and are not valued in a meaningful way, right? This is the whole reason that we have carbon markets, is to price carbon and address that market failure of the environmental externalities of this incredibly consumptive and destructive capitalist economy that's driven by a need for unending growth. And so the ability to harness market forces to solve that problem and to begin to internalize the cost of those externalities, particularly on a voluntary basis, is still frankly nothing short of miraculous.
It is. It isn't not only miraculous, but it's kind of elegant in its design, right?
100%.
It's effectively like you said, the voracious appetite of capitalist economies is essentially what's led us down this pathway. But effectively saying, why don't we turn it on itself? Effectively, let's harness the power of the market, which clearly is the key driver, which is essentially driven by growth and greed, effectively. But why can't we leverage that as a force of good and actually channel finance to where it can actually deliver impact at its highest scale and at the lowest possible cost? And then now you have not only the pricing, but you have a leverage tool that can be applied to help to people and companies to actually go along this journey.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think telling the story of the impact is something that we collectively have not done a particularly good job of. And so lifting up those voices, and on my darkest days, on the days when that relentless tide of negative news really starts to hit home, the thing that I have to go back to is the people in the communities who do not have the privilege of the don't have the privilege or the opportunity to participate in these dialogues, right? Like we are having a largely global north dialogue around what the appropriate level, form, structure, type of carbon finance and decarbonization resources that we're going to provide to the developed world. And frankly, part of, in my mind, the work of this market is to decolonialize that process. It is to put the power back in the hands of local communities and of developing governments to really say, we have this resource, which is all of the climate benefits that we can deliver in a quantified and verified way. And we don't need that emission reduction ourselves necessarily, but we know you do, and you should pay for it. And so this market enables us to actually facilitate the transfer of that wealth for those delivered mitigation outcomes. So carbon markets deliver results-based payments in one of the most effective ways. Someone yesterday was talking about not co-benefits, but core benefits. And I love that in the carbon market because particularly nature-based interventions just deliver this enormous set of additional benefits that are mostly now unquantified, and you will see a little bit of a price premium bump in the credits because people care about having a CCB certification. But we're in very early days still of quantifying all of those additional benefits that these projects are delivering. But one of the my favorite stories is when I was diligencing a project. It's a very large dryland forest restoration project in Africa. I'm talking to the developer about all the things that they're doing and the community benefits and the economic development and the jobs and the elephants that use it to move between one national park and another national park. And oh, by the way, this project also happens to cover the entire headwaters of the freshwater drinking source of a city of 1 million people. And it wasn't even, it was barely even in the project documentation, right? It was just this throwaway, oh, by the way. But if you think about how central forests are to water and what incredible stress a lot of these communities and ecosystems are under right now as a direct result of the impacts of climate change and the extreme weather that we're starting to see manifest, those types of core benefits are absolutely essential to being, I think, to valuing and integrating and really thinking more strategically and comprehensively about. And so the work under the ICVCM that we're doing on this next year is really going to cover the full breadth of social safeguards, benefit sharing, best practice and transparency requirements, and also new guidance around how you quantify and think about gender impact, social impacts, building on a lot of the good work that's already been done in this space from across the voluntary carbon market and the existing standard setting bodies as well. So just helping to really set that threshold bar for this is what we expect to see when we're thinking about social benefits, co-benefits, free, prior, and informed consent, really codifying all of those core practices that we know are so incredibly important. And then also thinking about where are the opportunities that we have to really start to accelerate and make it simpler and easier for local communities, for indigenous groups and other related parties to start moving through the project development process and cycle and pipeline more efficiently. So there's a huge amount of work to do. There's a lot of good work to build on here, but there's no question that this market needs to do better on making sure that we really are both recognizing where we're doing well and telling those stories, and also really thinking about how do we collectively raise the bar to ensure that we have a high degree of confidence that communities are being treated fairly, that they're being engaged in an equitable and just way, and that we are supporting the development of self-determination mechanisms and strong governance and institutional arrangements so that as what is life-changing amounts of money begins to flow into these communities, those are properly managed and protected. So we're really looking forward to that set of work as well next year, and to seeing that really get incorporated in the market more broadly.
So that's, it's hugely inspirational because essentially what you've outlined is optimism, which has been sorely lacking in the market this year. I think you mentioned, the continuous sort of death loop of negativity that seems to be pervasive in this market, and there's certain publications in the media that are really have a bias that's just vitriolic against this market solution that delivers inarguably results, because you said results-based payment. That's the core tenet of this market, essentially, and it's often forgotten. And essentially, it's been denigrated essentially as a way out of like an indulgence, and it's not. Can you talk about specifically that point there around the data? And again, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. So now coming back to the data piece. There are a number of studies that have been published this year, right? Trove, which is now MSCI, Silvera, B0, and a number of others that have effectively looked at the claims that voluntary buyers are making, right? And those that are essentially purchasing offsets and retiring them against their carbon footprints to manage those liabilities, and how they're tracking versus essentially a control group, right, of those that are not taking voluntary action.
Totally.
And the data was resounding, saying that taking voluntary action actually makes a tangible difference with regards to the internal abatement. So it's not either or. They're doing both. They're doing the hard work of decarbonizing internally and offsetting the residual emissions. Do you want to comment on that for a sec?
Absolutely. And as someone who had the opportunity to build a sustainability program at a Fortune 500 company from the ground up, really that experience really brought home to me how difficult it is to decarbonize a company that operates in the real economy. Fossil fuels touch every single product, production, activity, everything we do, every building material, our entire transportation system. There's all of
not just energy,
exactly.
right? Not the planes that we fly, the cars.
Yes,
everything.
And so there is, unfortunately, no magic decarbonization wand that is going to enable us to make all of this infrastructure that runs on cheap, abundant, energy-dense resources that is heavily subsidized, so fossil fuels across the board, disappear tomorrow. It's just, we can't do it. It's going to take decades. We can decarbonize this economy, and we need to get going. We clearly needed to get going 20 years ago. But better late than never, and every nth of a degree that we shave matters. But the question we face now is really an existential one. It's how do we stabilize global atmospheric concentrations of CO2 and other global warming gases quickly and effectively so that we can work through the multi-decadal process of decarbonizing the entire global economy. So in certain sectors, we're seeing that transformation really start to accelerate and take place, renewable energy in particular globally. But even that is not just, oh, yep, for sure, we're going to do all of that tomorrow in every market.
We need to triple the volume.
We need to triple the volume. But we also need to think and acknowledge that, just because we're at cost parity with fossils in the United States doesn't mean that we're at cost parity in a lot of emerging economies. So really working through a coordinated and aligned global transition strategy is going to be particularly important. So for companies, the things that we have control over are our operations and sometimes parts of our supply chain, right?
But that's infinitely more difficult. Like supply chains is so
enormously challenging.
They're webs, and they're very, very challenging.
Correct.
I mean, even going back to what you were saying around the energy piece on renewables, it is, it's a great news story. There's a corollary with regards to carbon markets, but just the deployment of renewables alone isn't necessarily going to be easy or financially viable in certain jurisdictions, as you mentioned. But there's actually underlying issues, the second order issues as well of the grid. The grid is essentially being decentralized oftentimes by renewables, whereas coal-fired power plants had this centralization kind of model, big coal-fired power plants in one location, big transmission grids. And now with energy storage, right, with batteries, etc., you can effectively decentralize those grids as well. So there's this underlying infrastructure build that also needs to happen as well. All of this costs money, right?
100%.
And so these are really systemic sort of transformations that are underway, and carbon is universal because it's ubiquitous, right? It is essentially the one commodity that links everything, right? And so it is really important that we price it so that we can actually start to deliver these impacts at the systemic level, as you're saying. And then now coming back to the supply chain, I'd love to get your input on that, because it's a notoriously difficult subject matter for folks to grapple with.
It absolutely is, and I think we need and want leading companies, particularly leading companies that are highly profitable and willing to pay a premium, to get going now and to push really hard and really fast and pay, the green premium that is unfortunately still associated with a lot of these earlier stage technologies that are just not yet available at scale. So the next decade, particularly from a corporate decarbonization standpoint, is going to be about a lot of investment in early and new technologies. So we had a crawl, walk, run strategy at Netflix when I was there, and what we found, for example, a lot of the emissions in our Scope 1 and Scope 2, Scope 1 and Scope 3 emission profile come from diesel generators, from the productions of making movies. And when we went out to market to look for alternatives to diesel generators that met the technical specifications of the production industry, we found that they didn't exist.
So what happens in that case? Do you have to help your
Yeah, so what we did is
build
we gave a large grant to RMI and partnered with other leading companies in the market to launch something called the Clean Mobile Power Initiative. And the Clean Mobile Power Initiative is essentially market making. So it's started a technology incubator. They're going out and supporting early stage startups, provided the technical specifications to the companies that the early stage companies that they're working with to help advance that set of work. And I'm optimistic that by 2030, 2035, we will have cost competitive, widely commercially available alternatives to diesel generators that can be applied to support the production industry. But that's 7 to 10 years from now.
Yeah.
And so as a company, we want to be doing that work, and we need to be focusing on that hard, expensive internal decarbonization work. And also, we can help invest and increase financial flows and take responsibility for the residual emissions above and beyond what you're able to deliver on your progress towards your science-based target. And that actually really has changed since, we were having these early conversations in the mid-2000s. It used to be that it was more of an either or, like either you were buying carbon credits and you were carbon neutral, or you were setting sort of modest internal decarbonization goals. And now, in large part, thanks to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, companies are stepping up and saying, yep, we are going to do the hard, expensive, slow transformation work that absolutely has to happen if we're going to avert catastrophic climate change. And then also, leading companies are saying, and I want to do more. I want to take responsibility for those residual emissions, and through that process, I'll do it through the thing that's available to me, which is high-quality carbon credits. So I can go and buy carbon credits and climate impact, today as a company relatively easily. And so that opportunity to mobilize all of that additional money that would otherwise be on the sidelines while we're waiting for the new technologies to become available would be lost. So for me, it's sort of amazing that we're at this point where we have environmental organizations saying, no, actually, we don't want you to do that, companies. I don't understand it, because I'm in this market as an environmentalist and as a climate change activist, and I know most of the people who participate in the carbon market would consider themselves the same.
Very much so.
And so why we would leave an opportunity to mobilize significant amounts of additional finance and verified and delivered mitigation outcomes on the table, and corporate dollars that are willing to be mobilized now on a voluntary basis on the table, frankly boggles the mind.
No, that completely boggles the mind. It's actually logical. And effectively, that argument that you mentioned that oftentimes the NGO community on the environmental side tend to be staunch kind of opponents of carbon markets.
Yep.
It is illogical. It's a straw man argument as well. Like you mentioned it. It's like it is a hard path to decarbonize internally, and in the absence of an external price and even an internal price on those emissions, of those residual emissions, then you're effectively kicking the can down the road. That means you'll have this very slow and small incremental decrease in your emissions, and maybe on a on a percentage basis, like let's say with efficiency, but on an absolute basis, many companies actually increase their emissions.
Totally.
And it's perverse because then you're not having a counterbalance to those residual emissions. And
That's
then
right.
effectively they could just defer it to much later on, but we don't have the time.
Yep.
What we have is a scarcity of the actual emissions that are allowable into the atmosphere if we're to avoid the worst effects of climate change.
Yep.
And that's what carbon markets bring, is a tool and a potential solution to this very difficult and overwhelming problem in an instance, right?
Absolutely. And, I am sympathetic to folks who, are concerned about the integrity of what is being delivered through this market. And I think there, in the past have been examples of credits that do not meet the quality threshold that you need them to meet. And in a world where every climate mitigation dollar is scarce and precious, we need to make sure, and the job of this market and the standard setters in this market is to make sure that every single dollar that goes into mitigation is driving new, additional, meaningful climate contributions. That's incredibly important. But also, these are verified mitigation outcomes. And from the perspective of the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where the emission reduction comes from.
One atmosphere.
At all, right.
Yeah.
There's only one ledger that matters, and that's the atmosphere. And so I think we missed an opportunity to think more comprehensively and frankly logically about the ways in which we collectively can address this challenge, putting forward and thinking about taking advantage of the lowest cost, most impactful, and frankly most just opportunities for mitigation that exist in the world today, right? So the IPCC is abundantly clear about what we need to do between now and 2030. We need to massively scale investment and deployment of renewable energy, both solar and wind. We need to stop cutting down tropical forests. We need to begin to restore degraded ecosystems and reduce emissions from agriculture. And we need to deal with methane. Those are the top 5 things, and all of those mitigation opportunities clock in at well under $100 a ton, and in many instances at under $20 a ton. And so the opportunity to use this market to help address and deliver the set of mitigation imperatives that the IPCC is so clear about is incredibly exciting to me, and also seems like kind of a no-brainer.
No, I love that. Thank you for that.